1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Perfect. Let's get Jeanette a test. Perfect. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Testing 1, 2, 3. Good. Okay. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
that's why we have to physically put them up here. Oh, so there's not enough seats? Oh, I expect all of them to participate. Okay, that's, do you know, so if all of them are participating, so we'll just put up here and clean up? Okay. But I have the list here.
How are you? Did you get any sleep in after your
No. I mean, I
Did you get
tried.
makeup on you or this morning?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. That was the only positive thing. I didn't have to do my own, but I just could not sleep after. I was telling Shasmina I couldn't sleep after the town hall last night.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I saw that schedule and I was like going from a town hall that ends at 10
Yeah.
and straight into it because your TV hit was what, 5:30 or
Yeah,
something
I
this
mean,
morning?
there's no real good option because even doing it Tuesday morning, which Jenna had originally suggested, would have meant the first day I come back from Seattle.
Yeah.
You know, we're still totally on Seattle timing, and then going late at night, starting early in the morning, going late at night. That also didn't feel very tenable. But I'm not going to go to the retreat today. I'll just hang out
really?
here and
That's
tomorrow.
nice.
Yeah.
And Steve's here, right? So you, that'll be nice.
It's just not
Together.
I looked at my calendar and I'm like, I don't need to go to this. Why am I doing?
Is he going with you to the retreat?
Yeah, because we're going to Philly after that.
Okay. Oh, really?
I'm getting a award right
Yeah.
NEA
Yeah.
on Saturday.
Subcommittee will come to order, and the purpose of this hearing is to discuss the deteriorating state of religious freedom in Nigeria and the urgent need to redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern pursuant to the International Religious Freedom Act. I would like to recognize myself for an opening comment, and will yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Jacobs, for any opening comments she might have, and members of the subcommittee. According to the Catholic News Agency and EWTN News, quote, Archbishop Ignatius Kagama is concerned over the seemingly endless violence against Christians that claimed at least 58 lives this past weekend and hundreds of others in recent weeks. It is our prayer, he said, that something definitive will be done to stop the situation that is inhuman. Shockingly, that was more than a dozen years ago and part of my opening remarks at a hearing that I held on July 10th, 2012, one of several hearings, 8 in all, on religious persecution in Nigeria, and since then, things have only gotten worse. 1 year later, in 2013, I visited Archbishop Kagama in Jos, Nigeria. We visited churches, 5 of them that had been recently firebombed by Boko Haram, and spent hours listening to survivors tell their stories. Despite their numbing loss and pain, I was absolutely amazed at the survivors about their faith, very deep faith, their courage and the resilience. They were not going to quit, but they were looking to the government for help, and it was not coming. I also met with an evangelical believer named Habila Adamu. Dragged from his home by Boko Haram terrorists, he was ordered to renounce his faith. With an AK-47 pressed to his face, he was asked, "Are you ready to die as a Christian?" With extraordinary courage, Habila answered, "Yes, I am ready to die as a Christian." He was asked a second time, and he repeated his answer. His wife was pleading, "Please don't kill my husband." And yet he said, "Yes, I am ready to die as a Christian." This time, the terrorist pulled the trigger. A bullet ripped through Habila's face. He crumpled to the ground, bleeding profusely, left for dead. By some miracle, he survived. I met him at an IDB camp in Jos. I asked him to come to Washington to tell his story. He did. And at the congressional hearing, he said this to our subcommittee, this subcommittee: "I am alive because God wants you to have this message. Knowing Christ is so much deeper than merely knowing Boko Haram's story of hate and intolerance." He closed his testimony with this: "Do everything you can to end this ruthless religious persecution, but know Christ first." To the end, everything he did was to witness, to radiate his love for God, but he was also calling on us to get involved and do something. Since then, however, the wanton violence against Christians in Nigeria has grown significantly worse. A couple of days ago, the Pillar Catholic reported, and I quote, "While Christians are receiving ashes last Wednesday to begin Lent, news broke out in Nigeria that a priest had been brutally murdered by kidnappers who had stormed his rectory the night before and kidnapped him. With deep sorrow and righteous indignation, I condemn in the strongest terms the relentless and tragic wave of kidnappings targeting priests, pastoral agents, and the faithful," Bishop Kundi said in a March 7th, just a couple days ago, press conference, which expressed outrage over the kidnaps and the brutal murder of his priests. According to the sources in the diocese, Father Sylvester was bound by his kidnappers. He was shot in the head, and I saw the picture. It is heartbreaking to look at. Shot at close range with an assault rifle, and according to the officials of his diocese. The systematic slaughter and abuse of Nigerian believers must stop. Delay is denial and a death sentence to so many. One of our distinguished witnesses today, Bishop Wilfred Anagbe of the Diocese of Makurdi, Nigeria, traveled a long distance to be with us today and will testify, and this is from his testimony: militant Fulani herdsmen are terrorists. They steal and vandalize. They kill and boast about it. They kidnap and rape, and they enjoy total impunity for this from the elected officials. None of them, I repeat his quote, none of them have been arrested and brought to justice. In December of 2020, President Trump designated Nigeria as a country of particular concern, only to be reversed without justification by Secretary Blinken in November of 2021. And I know I asked him at hearings. I asked him privately, but also asked him at open hearings, why? Never got a good answer. Religious leaders in Nigeria were outraged by the Secretary's decision. One Nigerian bishop challenged the Secretary and said, "Christian persecution is more intense than ever." And that was Bishop Mamza. And Genocide Watch has called Nigeria a killing field of defenseless Christians, quote unquote. Yet the government of Nigeria has failed to make progress against religiously motivated persecution of Christians, despite religious freedom being enshrined as an essential human right in their constitution. Likewise, Nigerian legal framework supports pluralism at both federal and state levels, but glaring contradictions exist, especially with laws that criminalize blasphemy, some even carrying the death penalty. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, USCIRF, was, quote, appalled that the State Department did not redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. USCIRF had recommended, and we have the former chairman here, Tony Perkins, had recommended this designation 4 years in a row, from 2021 to 2024, and said, quote, there is no justification as to why the State Department continues to fail to redesignate Nigeria as a CPC. And again, CPC, as you know, carries significant sanctions, a whole broad array of sanctions that the President and the Secretary of State are empowered to level on a country that commits persecution. When the former Secretary of State Blinken held a joint press conference with the Nigerian Foreign Minister on January 23, 2024, following the Christmas Eve massacre, which targeted killings by radical Fulani terrorists and took the lives of hundreds of Christians, he did offer his condolences, and I watched it. I was glad to see that. But we need to take it beyond just saying, I feel sorry for you. And these Christian killings recurred the following year, just 3 months ago. Make no mistake, these ongoing attacks are based on religion and diverting attention from it tonight. So let me just say parenthetically, I tried for 3 years to get the Clinton administration to designate Boko Haram as an FTO, of the Obama administration, as a foreign terrorist organization. I held hearing after hearing, and they wouldn't do it. On the day I was marking up my legislation to do this, just that, State Department said, oh, we're going to designate them an FTO. And after all the crimes they were committing, later it was the Chibok girls, it was all the other atrocities being committed by Boko Haram, and they wouldn't even give them the FTO status so we could start investigating where they get their money, their weapons, and the like. Make no mistake, all of these attacks are based on religion, like I said, and diverting attention from it denies that we have seen with our own eyes. This is religious cleansing. It needs to stop, and the perpetrators need to be brought to justice. Last year, the House Foreign Affairs did adopt my resolution, HRES 82, calling on the Biden administration to redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. It passed exactly 1 year ago, almost a year ago, in the committee, but it never came to the floor. While I strongly believe that President Trump will again designate Nigeria as a CPC and do much more to assist the persecuted church, including the outreach to the Nigerian president, Tinubu, last night I did reintroduce the resolution, and I hope we will have a robust debate and it will get marked up. Help can't come fast enough. The killing fields are every day, every single day, and we need to do more and do everything within our power to try to mitigate it. Let's not forget these horrifying facts. Northern Nigeria, and this is just northern Nigeria alone, has seen the destruction of over 18,000 churches since 2009. 18,000 churches. I saw 5 of them, totally burnt out, and many people killed with car bombs and the like. An August 2024 report from the Observatory for Religious Freedom in Africa found that 55,910 people were killed and 21,000 people were abducted in the context of terror groups in Nigeria within just 4 years, from October 2019 to September 2023. I would point out that approximately 34,000 are moderate Muslims that have been murdered in Islamic attacks, and we speak out for them as well. I have met with imams in Nigeria, and if they speak, they're visited that following week by one of these radical Islamist groups, and it's not pretty. They'll kill them or do other kinds of mischief. About 5 million Christians have been displaced and forced into internally displaced person camps, IDP camps, within Nigeria. The 2023 watch list released in January by Open Doors this past January found that 89% of Christians, 89% of the Christians who were martyred in the world are in one country, Nigeria. The targeted violence starkly highlights the precarious state of religious freedom in Nigeria. Again, we're asking the President, Tinubu, he's got to take action. And we're going to, I'm hoping to lead a delegation to Nigeria. We've got to raise these issues but it starts at the top. You know, I've been to Abuja many times. The president has real power. He can do it. And we're calling on him to do that. Let me also say that and I will put the rest of my statement into the record, but this hearing, we're hoping will be a catalyst for action by our own government and also by Congress and, of course, above all, the executive branch. You know, the new president has a lot to do, and I think he'll do this, and then, if necessary, impose sanctions. Where that has happened, there is change. Where it doesn't happen, the status quo, the killing fields continue. I'd like to yield to Ms. Jacobs for any opening comments you might have.
Well, thank you, Chairman Smith, and to all the witnesses for testifying today on conflict and religious persecution in Nigeria. I think all of us here know that the African continent is at a pivotal moment. The continent is the youngest in the world, and in Nigeria alone, 70% of the population is under 35, and 40% is under 15. So it represents the future generations who will continue to lead and solve the world's challenges. Nigeria has a unique position as a bellwether, as Africa's largest economy, most populous nation, and a significant actor in the region and on the world stage. Meanwhile, Nigeria is facing its own challenges, like rising insecurity, shrinking freedom of expression, and a struggling economy, which are preventing the country from experiencing long-term stability and prosperity. That's why I'm glad this subcommittee is convening a hearing to discuss some of the challenges facing Nigeria, and I hope we can use this as an opportunity to discuss how the United States can use its full range of tools to help address conflict and violence across the country. Nigeria is facing multiple different security challenges in various parts of the country, including violent extremist groups, criminal banditry, farmer-herder conflict, and religiously motivated violence. Several factors are driving these conflicts. Yes, religion is a factor, but other dynamics like climate change, population pressures, and governance challenges are important drivers that need to be addressed as well. For example, in Northeast, where Boko Haram and now ISIS West Africa are active, decades of marginalization and over-securitized responses have led to human rights abuses and instigated and exacerbated the conflict. I actually worked on Nigeria when I was at the State Department, and I have seen that for years, governance challenges like corruption, marginalization, and impunity have driven violence and conflict. A history of marginalization and limited access to basic needs in central and northern Nigeria and among different ethnic groups have created grievances that fuel further violence. So we must address these fundamental challenges to ensure stabilization and security and prevent violence in the long term. I am also concerned by the state of freedom of religion or belief in Nigeria. However, we need to be careful in our characterization of this complex challenge. Roughly half of the population of Nigeria is Muslim, while the other half is Christian, and violations of this freedom impact both groups. Oversimplistic narratives about the violence perpetuate harmful stereotypes and motivate tensions and violence based on religious identity. On the question of a potential country of particular concern designated for Nigeria, the Trump administration should make a determination based on the criteria provided in the International Religious Freedom Act. But we cannot ignore the other tools in our toolbox, especially foreign assistance, which has been effective at supporting Nigerians with addressing the key drivers of conflict and religious freedom violations. For years, the United States has supported Nigerian institutions, civil society, faith-based leaders, and researchers to address the conflict, violence, and religious freedom challenges. But unfortunately, President Trump has canceled hundreds of millions of dollars in these programs, leaving the United States less equipped to address the topic of today's hearing. Trump canceled all of our peace, democracy, and governance activities worth $74 million. These programs helped improve early response to conflict, bolster the justice system, and facilitate dialogue. He canceled all of our education and economic growth programs, altogether totaling nearly $170 million. These projects were getting at the root cause of conflict and violence across the country. And that's not to mention all of the canceled humanitarian assistance that was helping those who've survived war and conflict. Trump's aid freeze has closed clinics and left over 2 million Nigerians without access to HIV medication. In total, President Trump canceled 54 foreign assistance programs just in Nigeria. Mr. Chair, I request unanimous consent to submit a document listing all paused or terminated programs in Nigeria into the record. Thank you. So if we want the United States to help improve conflict in Nigeria, we can't pull back and eliminate our toolbox, which is exactly what the Trump administration is doing. So I hope that during this hearing, we can hear more about what the United States can actually do to support Nigerians in a whole of government approach to address conflict and violence and protect religious freedom. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Japel?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome the witnesses and I thank you for your testimony. Nigeria is Africa's largest economy and most populous country. It is a critical player in the region, and maintaining a strong U.S.-Nigeria relationship based on shared values is essential. Nigeria is a diverse country with hundreds of ethnic and linguistic groups and has one of the largest populations of Christians in Africa. The country is split nearly evenly between Muslims in the north and Christians in the south. In 2023, over 3,500 people were kidnapped, almost 9,000 were killed in conflict. So the work that must be done includes essential efforts to bring these diverse communities together and strengthen governance to end corruption and violence. It is both logical and necessary for the United States to fund projects in Nigeria that engage local communities to create space for interfaith dialogue and address the root causes of violence, such as access to resources, education, and healthcare, with the nuance that they deserve. These are not trivial, unnecessary projects. This is the work that has to be done to stabilize a country, to bring humanitarian assistance to those caught in the midst of violence and conflict and extremism, and bring about peace. Let me be clear that the mass cancellation of USAID projects and the dismantling of USAID by the Trump administration will only worsen this violence and weaken the institutions needed to combat extremism before it reaches our borders. Before the reckless actions of the Trump administration, the United States was the largest donor to the humanitarian response in Nigeria, but the administration's attack on foreign assistance, on diversity initiatives, and so-called wokeism are weakening the very tools that we need to address these complex crises. I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses and discussing more the situation and what the United States can do to make sure that we remain a strong partner in supporting the governance of Nigeria. I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome our very distinguished panel. Thank them for taking the time to be here, for traveling a long distance, Bishop. And we're looking forward to your testimonies because we need your insights as we proceed forward. Let me first begin by introducing Nina Shea, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute, where she directs the Center for Religious Freedom, an entity she founded back in 1986. Ms. Shea has been a human rights lawyer for over 30 years. She works extensively for the advancement of individual religious freedom and other human rights in U.S. foreign policy. Again, she's been a frequent witness, House and Senate, on a myriad of countries and issues, especially China and their egregious human rights abuses, particularly as it relates to religious freedom. Beginning in 1999, she was appointed for 7 terms by the U.S. House to serve as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. She was appointed as a U.S. delegate to the UN's main human rights body by both Republican and Democrat administrations. A lawyer by training, she undertakes analysis and strategic advocacy regarding religious freedom as a component of U.S. foreign policy. Her first client before the UN was Soviet Nobel Peace Prize laureate Sakharov. She was also the principal leader of the Coalition for International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. She initiated the executive order on advancing religious freedom, directing the prioritization of religious freedom in U.S. foreign policy, and which was signed by President Trump on June 2nd, 2020. And she co-authored 3 books on religious persecution, including Silenced, How Apostasy and Blasphemy Codes Are Choking Freedom Worldwide. She writes frequently in the Wall Street Journal, National Review, and elsewhere. We will then hear from Tony Perkins, who is president of the Family Research Council. He is also the former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Prior to joining FRC in August of 2003, he served in the Louisiana legislature, where he was a leading pro-life, pro-family voice. During his tenure, he expanded the organization to reach beyond Washington and has made a huge network, particularly of churches overseas, which really are speaking up not just for faith, but for freedom. And I appreciate that. In 2018, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell appointed Tony to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. In May 2020, he was reappointed, and he, like I said, served as both chair and vice chair of that very important commission, which was created by the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. Then we'll hear from His Excellency, Bishop Wilfred Anagbe, who is the Bishop of Makurdi Diocese in Benue State of Nigeria. Thank you for traveling all this way to be here, Bishop, a very long route. We deeply appreciate that. He entered religious life as a Claretian missionary and has carried out many administrative duties of the order. He was ordained as a priest on August 6, 1994, and then by Pope Francis on October 4th, 2014, the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi, to be a bishop. His motto is to serve Jesus and the brethren. The diocese that he leads is where the worst of the violent persecution in Nigeria is occurring by militant Fulani, causing the highest number of displaced people living in internally displaced camps. Matter of fact, those camps are the source of daily attacks by the militant Islamic extremists. And one of the things that I have raised with Nigerian leaders, and I hope that the president will raise it himself, our president here in the United States, is that if we had an act of some kind, theft, murder, anything, and you call the police and they don't show up, that's what's happening throughout Nigeria. The delay becomes denial, and then there's no investigation and nobody is held to account. It's unbelievable that can exist, but it does. So thank you, Bishop, for bearing witness to a very ugly truth. We'll then hear from Ms. Onubogu, am I saying that right? Onubogu, who is the African Program Director at the Wilson Center. She is governance and democracy professional with nearly 2 decades of experience on Africa and U.S.-Africa relations, including working with African governments, international partners, civil society, academia, and the private sector. She most recently was the director of the West Africa program at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she led the strategic development and expansion of USIP's portfolio in Nigeria and coastal West Africa. In this position, she oversaw the design and implementation of projects to mitigate violent conflict, promote inclusion, and strengthen community-oriented security by partnering with African and U.S. policymakers, civic leaders, and organizations. I'd like to now turn the floor over to Nina Shea, and thank you. All of your statements in their entirety will be made a part of the record without objection, but please take the time that's necessary. We're not in a hurry. We want to hear from you, so please make sure that you convey that to us, your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Representative Jacobs, and members of the subcommittee, for prioritizing conflict and persecution in Nigeria as your very first hearing of this subcommittee for this session. And Chairman Smith, you've been a congressional hero to legions of persecuted victims of persecution around the world, and congratulations on your leadership of this subcommittee, your chairmanship. My testimony will focus on the persecution of Christian farming communities by militant Fulani Muslim herders. In the interest of time, I will not address the Islamist terror groups that are already designated as terrorist and sanctioned by the U.S. government. They include Boko Haram and the Islamic State of West Africa, which attacks Nigerians of all faith backgrounds. Nigeria now ranks 6 out of 66 on the just released 2025 Global Terrorism Index. Nigeria is the world's deadliest country for Christians, according to the respected group Open Doors. Currently, militant groups of nomadic Fulani Muslim herders are reported by the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, among others, to be the greatest threat to Nigerian Christians, particularly those that we're now seeing in the Middle Belt farming communities. In Benue, Plateau, Kaduna, and other Middle Belt states, thousands of Christians have been killed, maimed, and raped, and millions of them have been driven from their lands and are now homeless due to Fulani attacks. This is the heart of Nigeria's breadbasket, and as their farming families are slaughtered or forced to flee, the region's suffering is compounded by growing mass hunger. Moreover, the targeted indigenous people of the Middle Belt Christian communities face the Nigerian government's decision to tolerate this persecution. The federal government in Abuja remains passive in the face of desperate cries for help. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reports of Mimi, one of 2 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, in Benue State. She survived a Fulani attack 3 years ago while her family was tending the yam fields on her farm. It reports, when they looked up, they saw armed men. There was no time to run. The men raped and killed Mimi's 11-year-old daughter. Mimi herself was raped, and her husband was killed. A hunter later found her injured and unconscious and helped her into the bush. They hid her there for 2 days before it was safe enough for him to bring her to the camp. There she received medical treatment and reunited with her 2 sons, now aged 12 and 15. I lost everything, says Mimi. If you go to my village, everything has been burned down. I cannot farm any longer. And it's not only me, we all went through these things. The government allows Fulani violence to continue with impunity. There is broad concern that this reflects a plan to forcibly Islamize Nigeria in violation of its secular constitution. Last week, the Nigerian Catholic Bishops' Conference released a letter expressing deep concern that some of the 12 northern states that impose Sharia law ordered Catholic and other Christian schools closed for 5 weeks in forced observance of Ramadan, and they cited the Constitution's guarantee of a secular state. Over the last generation, a portion of the Fulani nomadic herder population has become well-armed with automatic weapons and aggressive in targeting undefended Christians in Nigeria's Middle Belt farming areas. Various observers on the ground assert that the Fulani militants are not attacking to graze cattle, as some maintain, but rather to drive out the Christians from their ancestral lands and to take control of land, of villages and larger geographic areas. The UNHCR report above states, quote, nearly all the 3,790 registered residents of Ichwa IDP camp and many other camps dotted around Benue State were smallholder farmers, forced here by violent land grabs. A Benue Catholic priest told reporters it's all about seizing the lands and changing the demography of Benue State. The Fulani terrorists want to seize the fertile lands of Benue, chase away the people from the land, and occupy the lands for themselves, he said. A 2023 study by Nigerian scholars on Plateau State found the great majority of Plateau's indigenous people from non-Fulani ethnic groups believe that Fulani violence is motivated by land grabbing, jihad, and Fulanization, compared with smaller percentages who blame cattle rustling. Cattle rustling does occur, but Fulani attacks are indiscriminate and devastate entire Christian villages. Ignoring citizens' appeals for help, Nigeria's government fails to effectively stop these attacks. Take Benue, where a Catholic priest and other Christians were recently abducted in Fulani raids. A priest identified to the press 3 key areas along the Benue River, and he names them. It's in my testimony, where Fulani terrorists crossed from Nasarawa State to attack overwhelmingly Christian villages in Benue. The government ignores church pleas to place military posts near these known hotspots or have naval patrols on the river, a Benue priest told me. Or Kaduna, where on February 26th, Truth Nigeria reported over 200 Christians are being held hostage, starved, and tortured in a camp near an army base in a wooded area off the busy Kaduna-Abuja expressway. It came to light when 3 months after being abducted from their homes, 8 hostages in dire condition were released after a ransom payment of equivalent to 27,000 US dollars. They had been chained, whipped, and starved and referred to as infidels by captives speaking the Fulani's Fulfulde language. They witnessed others dying from starvation or shot dead when the ransoms didn't come. And as far as we know, it's still there. And just last weekend, a Christian from Adamawa State, Sunday Jackson, had a death penalty upheld by the High Court of Nigeria for, in self-defense, killing an attacker on his property. The pontifical aid to the church in need counts scores of priests' kidnappings in Nigeria, with over 20 murdered in recent years. 7 Catholic priests have been kidnapped since January. A week ago, Father Sylvester of St. Mary's Church in Kaduna was kidnapped and slain. 2 pastors in Kaduna and Gombe states with the Evangelical Church of Winning All were murdered this year already. Abuja's Archbishop Kagame strongly criticized the escalating kidnappings of Catholic priests, citing, quote, poor leadership at all levels, local government, state government, and federal government. Some conclude that Abuja's passivity, including failing even to collect data on the attacks, shows government complicity. The board chair of the Nigerian private group International Society for Civil Liberties and the Rule of Law is among them. The State Department report on international religious freedom solely gives a neo-Marxian materialistic theory for Fulani aggression. It describes the relentless attacks against Christian farming families on their own farms and violence against priests and pastors in their church and rectories as clashes between 2 rural socioeconomic groups fighting over scarce natural resources, a result of climate change. It ignores the evidence. It overlooks possible radicalization of Fulani herdsmen who travel across porous borders in the Sahel and northeastern Nigeria, regions recognized by the U.S. government as terror hotbeds. It shows no concern for their automatic weapons, distributed reportedly by the Mayeti groups, the cattle breeders, lobbying association members. It disregards the Nigerian government's toleration of this violence by allowing it to continue with impunity. I therefore urge Congress to call for the State Department as a first step to designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. I am certain that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom will soon renew its recommendation of CPC designation for Nigeria. Placing Nigeria on the U.S.'s short list of the world's most egregious religious freedom violators is warranted and would be a foundation for further human rights initiatives by the new administration here. It is the law. It's standing up for religious freedom is part of American exceptionalism. It's part of our heritage, our traditions, and our Constitution to respect the unalienable right of religious freedom. That concludes my testimony. Thank you.
Ms. Shea, thank you so very much for your testimony, for your decades of dedication to this important issue. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and members of the subcommittee. First, let me thank you for your opening comments. It's refreshing to see we have agreement. We understand that there is a problem. Now coming to a solution is our challenge. So thank you for your insight. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Tony Perkins. I served as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2018 to 2022. And as the chairman said, I served as both chair and vice chair. From my time on USERV, I can tell you with certainty that the world is not paying enough attention to the growing humanitarian disaster in Nigeria. Despite its strategic importance as Africa's most populous country, these warning lights are flashing because of this systematic religious persecution driven primarily by Islamists, and it's going unaddressed. Christians are the primary targets. They're murdered, kidnapped, raped, and terrorized on almost a daily basis, as has already been discussed. The numbers are staggering. The brutality is unspeakable, and the silence from global leaders is deafening. Let me share just one recent example. On February 9th, Fulani terrorists armed with AK-47s, these are not hunting rifles, these are rifles designed to kill. I served, after coming out of the Marine Corps, I worked with the State Department in anti-terrorism and very familiar with the mode and operation of terrorists. They stormed a village in Gombe State. They first seized a 9-year-old boy from the Puma family and demanded ransom. They then sought out the Reverend Bala Galadima's home. They found him, they broke into his home, they demanded money. He pleaded with them, saying that he had none, but he offered them what he had. He had grain, so he offered them grain. They refused. They shot him 3 times, killing him. Sadly, this is not an isolated incident. In late January, Boko Haram launched a series of coordinated attacks on Christian villages in Chibok, the same region where 276 schoolgirls were kidnapped in 2014, Mr. Chairman. You'll remember that. We discussed it then. In fact, many of those girls remain captives to this day. The terrorists set homes and churches ablaze, destroyed livestock, and demanded that Christians convert or they die. More than 4,000 believers have been forced to flee for their lives in recent weeks alone. As has been mentioned, according to Open Doors, more Christians are murdered for their faith in Nigeria than any other country in the world. In 2024 alone, 3,100 Christians were killed. 2,830 were kidnapped. These are not just numbers. These are fathers, their mothers, their children, their families. The case of Leah Sherbu underscores the horror of this crisis. Leah was just 14 years old when Boko Haram kidnapped her and 108 other girls from their school in 2018. The terrorists eventually released all the girls except Leah. Why? Because she refused to renounce her Christian faith. Reports suggest she is still alive and now held as a prize by her captors, as she has been forced to bear children in captivity. As a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, I met with her family multiple times and worked with the previous administration to track her, hopefully trying to gain her freedom. We were not successful. This is what religious persecution in Nigeria looks like. It is violent, it is brutal, and it is worsening. In 2020, the Trump administration, based on recommendations from USCIRF, and I was a part of that leadership team, Nigeria was designated as a country of particular concern. This was an essential step, recognizing the Nigerian government was failing to protect religious minorities from systematic violence. Yet in 2021, the Biden administration inexplicably removed Nigeria's CPC designation, despite the fact that attack against Christians had increased. Former Secretary of State Antony Blinken later suggested in a meeting with USCIRF members, which I was present, that these massacres were caused by climate change, that desperate Fulani herders were simply looking for pasture land. Let me be clear, this is not about climate change. It's about a violent extremist ideology that seeks to eliminate Christianity from Nigeria's northern and central regions. The evidence is undeniable. This is systematic religious violence. The U.S. government must act, and they must act now. Nigeria must be redesignated a country of particular concern. The Biden administration's removal of this designation was a reckless mistake that emboldened the very terrorists who are slaughtering Christians. The evidence overwhelmingly meets the legal threshold under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which requires CPC status for governments that engage in or tolerate severe violations of religious freedom. That's exactly what Nigeria's government has done. It has failed to protect all of its citizens from religious violence. The U.S. must impose consequences. Under the International Religious Freedom Act, the President has the authority to take action against CPC-designated nations, including economic penalties. The U.S. should apply targeted sanctions against Nigerian officials who are complicit in religious persecution, as well as suspend certain trade benefits until concrete actions are taken to protect all Nigerians. Religious freedom protection must be tied to U.S.-Nigerian relations. The administration should make it clear that Nigeria's treatment of religious minorities will directly impact diplomatic and economic relations, including trade agreements and security assistance. And finally, the U.S. must reappoint a strong, high-profile ambassador for international religious freedom. During the first Trump administration, this role was used effectively under the leadership of Ambassador Sam Brownback to apply global pressure on persecuting nations. The momentum for that must be regained. In closing, Mr. Chairman, it is time for the United States to send an unmistakable message, to draw a red line. The slaughter of Christians and other religious minorities in Nigeria will not be tolerated. If Nigeria continues to allow terrorists to burn churches, execute pastors, and kidnap schoolgirls with impunity, there must be consequences. This is not just about Nigeria. It is about the future of religious freedom, the stability of Africa, the moral credibility of the United States. If we fail to act, make no mistake about it, this crisis will spread. Refugees will flood into neighboring countries. Terrorists will grow bolder. And America's silence will embolden jihadists worldwide. Chairman Smith, members of the committee, thank you for helping raise awareness of the need to redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. The world is watching, but more importantly, the religious persecution and those who are the victims of that in Nigeria are watching. And they're waiting to see if America will stand with them and for them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Perkins, for your testimony and your leadership as well. And your work on the Religious Freedom Commission was legendary. We do have Maureen Ferguson here with us today, who's a commissioner on the Religious Freedom Commission. Dominic Cuzo, who's a pastor from my district, who's very involved with the religious freedom issue. Thank you for being here. And I'd like to just point out David Trimble is here as well from RFI. When I did the bill in 2019, it was a religious freedom, Frank Wolf, we named it after Frank Wolf. Got it passed in the Senate. It was dead in the water on the Senate side, and he did so much to get it passed, and I want to thank him for that, because otherwise it would have been just another House-passed bill, like we all know. It goes over to the Senate, and that's the graveyard of legislation, but I want to thank him for what he did to get that through. I'd like to now recognize, and again, thank him profusely for traveling here, and at great risk. Bishop, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for giving me an opportunity to be heard at a critical time in my country, and particularly my state, Benue. I am Wilfred Anagbe, and appear here as the bishop, the Catholic Bishop of Makurdi Diocese, the capital of Benue State in Nigeria. I am the shepherd of one of the 4 dioceses, Catholic dioceses in Benue. We have others, Anglican, Methodist, and Pentecostals, which sort of Benue State has a population of about 6.1 million people, 2 million of whom are those under my care as the bishop of the diocese. Benue State is about 98% Christian, with very few Muslims living in towns. Nigeria and eventually my diocese and the state of Benue have become, in recent years, one of the most dangerous and insecure places for Christians. Christians and Muslims are nearly evenly divided among Nigeria's large population of over 200 million persons. Islamist extremists are fiercely contesting the possession, control, and governing law of the land, especially in the country's northern and central regions, the latter of which is where Benue is located. There are constant ethnic, political, and religious conflicts over land and allegiance. Constitutionally, we are a secularist country, but our unity has been fragile. Political and religious actions and even public speech have been carefully managed to avoid accusations of religious bias and political tensions. Today, the clear influence of Islamist extremists has changed the traditional social dynamics of tribe, ethnicity, religion, and the social status in Nigeria. Because just recently, at the beginning of the Ramadan fast, 12 states in northern Nigeria have declared closed schools so that they attend to this. And you can imagine, which other country in the world does that? Saudi Arabia is not doing it. Afghanistan is not doing it. Baghdad is not doing it, but then Nigeria is practicing. What kind of Islam are they practicing? 12 states, and not only Muslims are living in these places. What happens with the educational program or curriculum of the country? But this is what we are going through every day in Nigeria. A long-term Islamic agenda to homogenize the population has been implemented over several presidencies through a strategy to reduce and eventually eliminate the Christian identity of half of the population. This strategy includes both violent and non-violent actions, such as the exclusion of Christians from positions of power and adoption of such church members, the raping of women, the killing and exploitation of Christians, the destruction of churches and farmlands of Christian farmers, followed by the occupation of such lands by the Fulani herders, and also changing the names of these villages. They are taking over the places, so you clearly see an expansionist approach and Islamic, and then they are making the people now flee and leave their villages, and they conquer it. The quest to Islamalize the land appears high on the agenda of some of the powerful and influential Muslims in Nigeria. There is a campaign to take land to spread Islam, and there is the hemorrhaging of Christian farmers from the central region of Nigeria and Benue State, and Makurdi Diocese in particular, as they are forced to abandon fertile lands that use to feed the nation, which classify Benue as the food basket of the nation. Militant Fulani herdsmen are terrorists destroying society. They steal and vandalize, they kill and boast about it. They kidnap and rape, and they enjoy total impunity from the elected authorities. None of them have been arrested and brought to justice. This is supported by the corrupt system in which we operate and the abject poverty among us, which allow the criminals to easily attract more recruits and prey on more victims. Why is this happening? Is it really a religious war? Like in the past, many jihadists are motivated less by religion than by spoils of war and use their religion to impose themselves. In my diocese, the spoils consist mainly of fertile, well-tended land organized around my parishes or so. The jihadists come and adopt and kill the priests, leaving thousands without support and basic human services. And of course, when they disperse the people, the inhabitants, or the citizens, or the people of the lands, they take over. And any attempt to go back and take care of your farms, surely you get killed. The Makurdi Diocese in Benue State has been the epicenter of the invasion by these herders, who are more like hired guns of cattle oligarchies, who manipulate religion to rally the herders to eliminate the Christian population and cleanse the land in the name of Islam. This objective is behind the relentless attacks against Benue's villages. When we call for help to the police and the army, they do not come. At the end of 2024, several villages were warned by the attackers of the upcoming violence, and the leaders called the police for defense ahead of time, but they did not come, and the Christian massacres, almost customary, took place, killing hundreds in Plateau and Benue, with the worst massacre claiming 47 people. The militant also burned down the 8 Catholic churches of St. Mary's Parish in the Diocese of Boko, which in Benue State, as well as the parish house, clinics, schools, and other houses. The militant Fulani herdsmen bear on defenseless villagers without consequences. They follow orders to conquer, kill, and occupy. They attack even those who have managed to escape into our IDP camps. Thereby, they have no place to run to. And it is unfortunate that the police system in Nigeria, orders have to come from above, and such that once there's a call, and they say they have never responded. And by the time they arrive, these people have left, and the people are now living in the pool of their blood. What I have recounted above is happening not only in Benue State. I believe our experience in Benue is symptomatic of what is happening elsewhere in large parts of Nigeria. The experience of the Nigerian Christians today can be summed up as that of a church under Islamist extermination. It is frightening to live there. Apart from the violent campaigns and attacks against Christian villages, there are now attempts by the Islamic Council of Nigeria and various Islamic groups to impose Sharia law on the Christian populations. Already, 12 states in the north of Nigeria are under this sectarian religious law and attempts to extend the same to the south of Nigeria, which they have started. This month, governors in the north decided appropriately to close all schools and education institutions during the months of Ramadan, leaving millions of students without learning opportunity for 5 weeks. We live in fear because at any point it can be our turn to be killed, but to remain silent is to die twice. So, I have chosen to speak. I speak on behalf of the millions who are in the camps. In Benue State, in Makurdi Diocese alone, in my diocese, I have about 9 camps. 9. On the 5th of March, which was Ash Wednesday, we visited one of the camps, and many of my priests and religious went to the other camps, distributed them to begin the Ash Wednesday with our faithful who are there, because we are the voice of the voiceless. We have to talk for the defenseless. We have to talk about the weak and those who cannot talk about themselves. In one of the camps called the Mega Camp, there were over 3,000 inmates of that camp, and which was a record given to us by government. I speak on behalf of them and those children who have no husband, who have no father, and even their own voices taken away by the politicians who promised to help them, but have become the willing tools of the jihadists because they are talking politically correct statements, looking for next elections to come. I speak on behalf of those whose loved ones have been killed, but no one has even offered a word of consolation to them. I speak on behalf of the thousands of young girls who have been adopted and raped because no one, not even the media, mentions them anymore. Foremost, I speak on behalf of my flock who are unable to worship freely and unable to return to their ancestral farms and homes because that land has been ruthlessly taken from them by the armed herdsmen. And where they say they want to live in peace with the natives, if you must farm, you have to pay tax to hire the land which belongs to you. That is slavery, to say the least about it. As prosperous Nigeria is in African continent, and I tell you, if there's outbreak of war in Nigeria, no country around us, Chad, Niger, Ghana, Guinea, Togo, no country can contain the population that will flee to these places. No country can be able to house over 5 million refugees. It's not possible because of that. And if 1 million refugees run to Chad and Niger, they'll collapse that country because there'll be no plan to take care of them. So we have to be very careful. Today, I urge you all to use every means within your mandate to start developing a strong and good relationship with Nigeria, where you know that when you speak of human dignity, you are also speaking of the same God-given right you believe is unalienable. Consider that Nigeria can be your ally, but it cannot be one where half the population is in the process of being moderately eliminated. Work with us, the churches, and other Nigerians of goodwill. We are working for a peaceful and prosperous society, and our desperate plight has been set aside U.S. policy for too long, to the cost of thousands of lives. Concretely, I request and I plead, I ask you to redesignate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. This has both a practical and diplomatic meaning to signal that you are paying attention to what happens to us and elsewhere in the world. Because the policies the government is trying to put in place, so that to return the IDPs, build camps for them, relocate them from their homes, it is not durable and it will not work, because the government has already the population that is not able to take care of. And then you have over millions of people in the camps, and you want to relocate them to where? And if you do, let's take that you do. How many houses or rooms will you give me who has 5 children, another one has 3, another one has 2, and what will I be doing for a living? These people previously never begged anybody for food. They were managing their lives, training their children, and building their homes. So nobody should have deceived us on the guys that you're going to reset to the IDPs. They have no jobs. So where you set them, what will be their place? And by the way, the fundamental question remains, if you resettle them to other camps or build places for them, what happens with the ancestral lands? Who takes care of them? And this is whereby I feel the government is complicit on this issue. Because these terrorists, Fulanis, displace them, kill people, and then occupy the place, and then change names, nomenclatures of these towns. For what reason? So we want to let the people go back to their homes and help for them to rebuild their lives. I implore this august body to insist on the return and rehabilitation of all the IDPs to their ancestral lands, and not to relocate them to other constructed camps elsewhere, which is an invented solution now being pushed in the Benue State government. And I tell you, Nigeria government can do that once they have to be accountable. Because I know Nigeria, under the auspices of ECOMOG, was able to reinstate constitutional government in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and they can do that now. We have the capacity, but because the leaders that are not prepared. And I think that's whereby I look, it's not just, conspiracy of silence, it is aiding, abetting, and supporting these terrorists to keep doing their work. This is my plea. Thank you very much for this attention.
Bishop, thank you very much for your testimony, and again for your courage to be here. We know you go back and you face risks, and our prayers are with you, but we will follow up on your admonitions that you have given us today. I'd like to now recognize our final witness, and Ms. Onubogu, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Jacobs, and distinguished committee members, I appreciate the opportunity to testify before this committee today. I serve as director of the Africa program at the Wilson Center, although the views expressed here are my own. In keeping with the nonpartisan policy-focused work of the Wilson Center, I offer the following comments and recommendations. Consecutive U.S. administrations have described the U.S. relationship with Nigeria as among the most important in Africa. This year marks 26 years of uninterrupted civilian rule in Nigeria, the longest period of constitutional governance since the country's independence in October 1960. Furthermore, as Nigeria serves a second-term, one-year chairmanship of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, the country's leaders understandably expect to lead regional coordination efforts, given Nigeria's size, political and economic influence, and decision-making power within the bloc. As ECOWAS turns 50 this year, good leadership will be crucial to address the rising threats to regional integration, security, and economic stability that have beset the sub-region in recent years. However, whether and how Nigeria tackles its own internal governance and security challenges will set the pace, not only at home in Nigeria, but also in the broader West Africa region. As Nigeria's internal struggles worsen, what is clear is that the country's instability is rooted in a vital shortcoming. After 64 years of independence, the country still struggles to cultivate a national identity rooted in basic freedoms and dignity for its people. In Nigeria today, ethnicity, religion, and language, not nationality, remain the benchmarks of personal identity for the country's highly diverse population. While Nigeria has witnessed repeated ethnic and religious clashes over the years, its ethnically and religiously diverse population is not the problem or the cause of these conflicts. The problem, however, is that ethnicity and religion in Nigeria have become instrumental markers that are used to mobilize and successfully acquire power, resources, and political dominance. It is important to understand the nature of violence in Nigeria and its causes, which extend beyond the religious or ethnic overtones that appear to motivate that animosity. I grew up in Jos, Plateau State, in Nigeria's Middle Belt region. I visit Jos regularly, including in December 2024, just a few days before the Christmas weekend attacks that killed and displaced hundreds. These types of attacks have plagued local communities in Plateau State for more than 20 years. Having grown up in the Middle Belt region, I am deeply aware of the compounding impacts of these protracted conflicts on one's vibrant communities. Whether labeled as banditry or terrorism or communal clashes or ethno-religious conflict, at the root of this violence is a failure of governance to meet the population's most basic needs, not only livelihoods, education, and healthcare, but also their need for perpetrators to be held legitimately accountable. Elections and political appointments are two important areas where the interplay between religion and politics is most clearly demonstrated in Nigeria. Nigerian political leaders romanticize Nigeria's unity, but do little to cultivate it. On the contrary, they often stoke ethnic and religious tensions in election campaigns, seemingly to distract from their failures to deliver for the people they are supposed to serve. The divisive political climate of the 2023 elections illustrated this tendency. Furthermore, off-cycle elections conducted in 2024 also exposed the fragility of Nigeria's electoral process, as some political actors openly intimidated election officials and violently disrupted elections, suspending by-elections in Kano, Akwa Ibom, and Enugu states. Certainly, recent data, as that from the non-denominational global network Open Doors, appears to indicate that violence against Christians, who make up 46% of the population, has been unaddressed by the previous Buhari administration, and no tangible progress has been made under the current Tinubu administration. But we also know that violence overall in Nigeria has increased over time. The National Human Rights Commission of Nigeria reported that complaints of human rights rose by 25% in February alone. The Nigerian Social Cohesion Survey conducted in 2022 also found that an overwhelming majority of Nigerians, 96% to be precise, consider human rights abuses and violations to be a problem in the country. This indicates not only that violence and rights abuses afflict many groups, but also that Nigerians understand and respect the concept of human rights. Now, let me offer some recommendations. A few recommendations to the United States. It is important to engage deeply and broadly with communities across Nigeria to better understand the nuances driving insecurity in the country. While it is never wise to dismiss religion as a cause of conflict, it is also unproductive to label a conflict as solely driven by religion when there are so many other factors at play. The root causes of Nigeria's conflicts and insecurity are deeper and more complex than generally discussed. Second, develop a holistic and long-term vision for U.S. engagement with Nigeria on issues of governance and security. The U.S.-Nigeria Binational Commission, formed in 2010, already provides a framework that supports country-to-country discussions on issues of security and governance. After 15 years, it is time to take stock. Discussions in the Commission should take a fresh look that emphasizes security partnership sustained over the long term, seeking areas where cooperation is still possible and efforts that are most promising for real change, such as local and non-government initiatives. Third, work more with Nigeria's states and its growing city centers. The U.S. government should decentralize its engagement with Nigeria by strengthening its dialogue with and support to receptive government and civic leaders at the state and local level. Next, support democratic actors that are advancing inclusive peace processes and conflict resolution. Civic and religious leaders in Nigeria can serve as important bridges between communities and government, especially in communities where the government lacks credibility. Partner with the Nigerian government to make accountability central to the response to conflict and persecution. Support the judiciary to uphold the rule of law and coordinate intelligence sharing with institutions of government that are working to track financial transactions related to suspected terrorist activity, including terrorist funding. Next, we should rethink US and international policies that lead to knee-jerk responses to crisis. Reactive, quick-win actions that may seem beneficial to Nigerians could have larger and far-reaching negative impacts. And finally, revive the US Congressional Bipartisan Caucus on Nigeria, which served as a space to prioritize discussions on issues of US-Nigeria relations. An active Congressional Bipartisan Caucus will signify the importance of US-Nigeria relations and create a forum to proactively consider wide perspectives on different issues of concern to better inform legislative response. And now, recommendations to the Nigerian government. Coordinate federal and state action and messaging. Effective coordination so desperately needed among Nigeria's federal and state governments is too often undermined by finger pointing. That must stop. Since assuming office, President Tinubu has called for better synergy and cooperation among security agencies to address insecurity in the country. However, concrete steps must be taken to move this aspiration to reality. Nigeria also needs to get serious about police reform. In December 2004, the governors of Nigeria's 36 states unanimously endorsed the establishment of state police as a measure to combat the nation's rising insecurity. While this is a significant shift in policing in Nigeria, it is still unclear how this will be operationalized. Police reform should not be about state policing only, but it should consist of a broader conversation that is rooted in the country's present realities and applies lessons learned from past efforts. Third, Nigeria needs to make accountability of perpetrators and of the authorities central to its response. Nigerians need justice. Criminality in the Middle Belt and elsewhere in other parts of the country has grown in part because of impunity. The trends underlining the violence that we see in different parts of the country can be traced and can be anticipated if the appropriate government security agencies have effective early warning and rapid response mechanisms. Nigeria should also start laying the groundwork for peaceful elections in 2027. This year, 2025, will be a critical year for elections in Nigeria, as the current chairperson of Nigeria's Election Commission completes his second and final term in December 2025. Finally, Nigeria needs to appoint an ambassador to the United States. It has been 18 months since Nigeria recalled its ambassador from Washington and other diplomatic missions worldwide. Nigeria needs senior diplomatic representation to deepen its engagement with the US across all spectrums, including in discussions like these, and to support and engage with Nigeria's dynamic and largely successful diaspora communities across the United States. In conclusion, clearly, a fresh approach is needed, both for Nigeria and for the US. US and international policies on Nigeria must include a better understanding of the country's complexities, stepping back to honestly reanalyze how governance in Nigeria really works and how it does not work is crucial to addressing the question of conflict and persecution in Nigeria. Thank you for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony, and I think your point about failure of governance couldn't be stronger stated. When the bishop said a moment ago that when they make calls to law enforcement to respond, they don't come. I have heard that over and over and over again, particularly as it relates to the Fulani, but I remember in the early days of Boko Haram, I had Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson testify at several of my hearings, Africa Assistant Secretary, and he just said Boko Haram was a group of bandits. They had no thread of wanting a caliphate, which we found out later they did, that they were not promoting aggressive Islamist views, which they were. And I did indicate in my opening comments that how we tried to get Boko Haram designated as a foreign terrorist organization, and they had even blown up a building that killed some, the UN types, including an American, in Abuja, and all of that was just overlooked. What Johnny Carson said here in this room at that hearing was that all as Boko Haram was trying to do was to embarrass Goodluck Jonathan, then the president. I said, are you kidding me? Embarrass him? How about when they took the Chibok girls, and I met with several of the Chibok girls that escaped. There were a few that escaped, and I met with many of their parents. It had everything to do with turning them into slaves and abusing them horribly and forcing them to change from being Christians. Some were Muslim to begin with, but not many, to a coercive conversion on their part. And that woke up some people here, but not enough. So your point about failure to govern I brought it up with Buhari many times as well and got nowhere. There was an effort to have a cooperation on the security side. There was a fusion center, as you might know. I visited it, where our military wanted to work side by side with their military to especially use the best and latest means of combating Boko Haram at the time, and they went nowhere. The Leahy Amendment was invoked by our side, so I had a hearing on that. Found out that half of the people that we could have trained would have easily passed muster under the Leahy Amendment. In other words, they didn't have human rights violations attributed to them. But it never happened. It was a great idea, but it went nowhere. So you're right. We need to revisit how do we work together on security. And again, if I call my local police department in Manchester, New Jersey, because a crime has been committed and they don't show up, that is a gross neglect and a gross failure to govern. And that is what, as we know, the Christians are facing each and every day. So I thank you for that. And I thank all of you. Just a couple of quick points, and I'll yield to my distinguished colleagues. In 2016, I should say, I did write the follow-on to Frank Wolf's famous historic law called the International Religious Freedom Act. We put a couple of things in there, entities of particular concern. Boko Haram is on that list, but I do think the Fulani need to be on that list as well, so that's something we should ask the administration to do. We had a designated persons list where individuals are committing egregious violations of human rights. Back in 2004, I was the author of the Belarus Democracy Act. That legislation, which was the first of its kind, and it led to the Magnitsky Act, because I was the sponsor of that. We put that into the NDAA to get it passed. But it said we target individuals, not just the whole country, but individuals who are particularly severe in what they do with no visa and no ability to engage economically with the United States in any way, shape, or form. My hope is that and I invite you, and I invite anyone who has pertinent information of any particular persons that need to be on that list so that we can individually sanction them. We've done it in other countries all over the world, started with Belarus, with Lukashenko, but others have been targeted as well. In DR Congo, a lot of Kabila's people were targeted. It's a very effective mechanism to isolate them while we're working on the country itself. So I invite you, any individuals that you think should be on there. And again, I do think that the Fulani ought to be an FTO as well. Not only should they be designated an entity of particular concern, but they need to go onto the foreign terrorist organization list because of what they're doing. Let me also, and get your thoughts on this, and remind everybody that country of particular concern requires an annual designation of countries where governments engage in or tolerate, that's the language of the statute, or tolerate particularly severe violations of religious freedom during the reporting year. During the Obama year, again, I had hearings on this again, they wouldn't even name countries. So I asked them, where's the countries? It says in the statute, you shall, doesn't say you may, and we didn't even get a country or a list of those countries. So we need to up our game, if you will, on promoting religious freedom everywhere. In Nigeria, in my opinion, it's just stands out as an area that we need to do so much more on. So if you want to speak to any of those thoughts about entities of particular concern, My hope is that the president, I think Mr. Perkins, you put it well, that a very robust effort will be coming soon with regards to religious freedom everywhere, including in Nigeria. I mean, the suffering brethren of all kinds. And I met with, every time I go, I meet with imams. If they speak out, they've got a mark on their back, and they'll be killed by the weekend. And I'm not exaggerating. I heard it from so many. I began to say, okay, they're not going to speak out. And I remember one particular imam telling me how Boko Haram, they're not us. And I said, I know that. You know, that they are a radicalized group of people who kill and maim and slaughter and rape in order to get their way. So law enforcement, if any of you want to speak to that, it seems to me that's so basic. If you don't have a government that responds to a request, if you had a fire going, would the firefighters show up? I hope so. Well, law enforcement needs to show up. And when they start prosecuting people, you'll see a different situation in Nigeria, I believe.
Well, if I may, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I think you're right. Everyone on this witness table has said the same thing, that there's been this failure to hold accountable the perpetrators of these atrocities. And it's actually worse than someone robbing your home. It's a systematic, coordinated attack that cleanses entire villages and farming areas of the population who have a certain religious profile that they don't like, I guess. But we don't know. We really don't know what the motives or intents are because the government doesn't investigate or bring to trial anyone for these horrible attacks. And as the bishop pointed out, and he is incredibly courageous to come forward today, as he said, he doesn't want to die twice. I hope not even once. But once this process happens of a clearing an entire village, burning the property, and taking control of it, the IDPs are then sent to temporary camps where the churches help or others help, and feed them and sustain them until they're permanently relocated somewhere else, maybe a bigger camp, maybe to other parts of the country, maybe outside the country. This is not making any sense. It's not sustainable. And I think there has to be personal pressure because the government is not, has no political will. So no amount of programs are going to help this unless there is help resolve the situation if there's no political will to do anything. And that's what we're seeing over and over, year after year, 20 years of the Fulani herdsmen armed to their teeth with AKs. According to scholars who've written about this, Nigerians, that these guns are given to them, these weapons are given to them by the breeders, the cattle breeders, the cattle oligarchs, as the bishop called them. And they have to be held accountable. Also, the top people in the government have to be held accountable on a personal level. They want their visas. They want their bank accounts in the United States. I think this would have teeth. It's already law, and we should be getting the names of the criminal justice people who are failing, who are in the leadership of the government. And you're right. Nigeria is America's most important partner in Africa, and it is a land of the future, and there's a lot of promise there, and we need to help them get control of the out-of-control terror, and particularly this Fulani problem, whatever you want to call it, terror or criminality.
Ms. Jacobs.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Onubogu, I want to start with you. I really appreciated what you said in your testimony about the need to understand the drivers of violence in Nigeria, which extend beyond religious and ethnic overtones. So I want to start off with a conversation by talking about what these drivers are. What do you see as the primary drivers of conflict and violence across the Middle Belt, and what are the political and economic, social, or historical factors that exacerbate the conflict in that region?
Thank you, Representative Jacobs. And if I may, before I respond to that, just to touch on a point about police reform, as was mentioned, Nigeria is significantly under-policed. And as I mentioned in my remarks, that there have been attempts at police reform. At least we've actually seen 3 from 2006, in 2009, and 2012. So the government has been engaging in trying to address the system with the way Nigeria is structured, Nigeria's security architecture, where the police is centered in the center of the country. As I mentioned, in December of last year, Nigerian state governors have started looking at decentralizing the police. A lot needs to be done to actually operationalize that, since these are conversations that have been happening for over 20 years. So actually trying to move that aspiration to reality is something, as I'd mentioned in recommendations, that the US could support the administration in looking at. In terms of the questions on the drivers of violence, as I'd mentioned in my remarks, where Nigeria's identity, the government has failed on really crafting an understanding of identity, one that is based on basic freedoms and dignity for the people. People still identify based on their ethnicity, religion, and language. And many politicians, political actors across the board, across the Middle Belt and in different parts of the country too as well, have tapped into this and used this to instigate violence or instigate conflict, mostly for the purposes of acquiring power, acquiring resources, and acquiring position. So this is at the root of Nigeria's is at the root of the conflicts that we see, taking it back to the question of governance and really understanding the history of violence and understanding the history of political participation in Nigeria is key and important if we are to really tackle these conflicts. If not, we end up the conflict that we see today is only a symptom of a much larger problems.
Thank you. And which types of U.S. government investments have been most effective in addressing some of these drivers of conflict?
In my opinion, programs that have been most effective are programs that really work in partnership with the government, in partnership with communities, programs that are able to inform and shape programs that are able to inform and design interventions that typically that are able to effectively tackle concerns that are identified by communities. It is important that communities are part and parcel of identifying the problem. And again, in terms of programs that we've also seen that has been successful in complex environments like Nigeria, involving nuanced views, involving diverse voices in these conversations have often led to progress.
Thank you. Mr. Perkins, I have a question for you. Last year, the State Department hired a seasoned expert to conduct an analysis of conflict and religious freedom dynamics in northern Nigeria. This expert was originally recommended by USERF Commissioner Frank Wolf to gain a better understanding of these issues and advise the department on the exact topic of this hearing today. Unfortunately, due to the Trump administration's aid freeze and cuts, this project is paused. Can you discuss the benefits of this kind of research project, what information it would help provide the U.S. government, and how this research could help us effectively address religious freedom challenges in Nigeria?
Certainly. I do think there are valuable projects in which the federal government, State Department does fund. But I think we have an overwhelming amount of evidence to suggest that we have a problem. And I think everyone agrees that whether religion, and I agree with the comments that have been made by everybody on both this panel as well as the members of the subcommittee, that this is a complex issue. But to deny the fact that, and I'm not suggesting anyone is denying this, but to say that religion is not a part of the mix would be to deny reality, because it is. It's been weaponized by some, as all of as testimony has given light to today. So we have the evidence there. I think that by moving forward with the designation, we get the attention of the country of Nigeria, and then hopefully the will of the Nigerian government to partner in legitimate programs, because there are many, you're absolutely correct, there are many legitimate programs that can help advance democracy and security in Nigeria. I worked with the State Department and part of those in developing the security of the local law enforcement. So there are legitimate ones. But I think I agree with the administration in pausing until we do an analysis of what is working and what is not.
Okay. Ms. Onubogu, do you think additional research on the conflict dynamics in northern Nigeria would be beneficial for the U.S. government's response? Thank you. So do I, and I implore the Trump administration to allow this project to continue and make sure our embassy is adequately staffed.
Thank you very much. I'd like to recognize Mr. Hazenga.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you holding this very important hearing. And this is actually something that we had done previously, or you had led. And good to see some of you folks again here. And I have a quick question at the front end of both the bishop and Ms. Onubogu, correct? Has Nigeria always been this violent?
Yes, not this level of violence, because this is almost like an open war declared on some parts of Nigeria. And then it is multidimensional from Boko Haram to bandits. Boko Haram is in the northeast. The bandits are in the northwest, and then the flying terrorists are in the north central, which is Middle Belt.
Yep.
And these attacks are simultaneously carried out in places whereby large scale of violence is being experienced, and the worsening part of it, the government is very, very inactive.
Onubogu, yeah, you were talking about the history of violence. Has it always been as violent as we're seeing today?
Yes, as I say, it's important to understand the nature of violence. As I mentioned in my remarks, this year basically marks 26 years of uninterrupted civilian rule, which means there was a transition in 1999 from military rule. Going back all the way to Nigeria's independence, every republic, dating back to the First Republic, we've always seen some forms of violence where that have often been shaped around identity lines, religion, or background. And as time has gone on, it has often taken on a different shape or form of its own. So it's important to understand that the violence is interconnected.
Yep.
Things may look different, but they are connected by the same underlying issues.
What I'm trying to understand, though, is has Nigeria always been this violent, and maybe a slightly different form, in your opinion?
There has always been an element of violence.
Sure, and there's been an element. Well, you're from Jos, and I'm familiar with Jos. I've had family members who have traveled to Jos and Lagos because the church denomination I happen to be a member of, I'm sure you're familiar with, which is the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church, based in Grand Rapids, Michigan, actually has more members in Nigeria than they do in all of North America. It is basically an African church headquartered in Grand Rapids, Michigan, of all things. And I will tell you that that the people that I have talked to who have been either on the mission field there or who have lived there or who have been a part of that, they believe that there has been an uptick in violence, and that the country wasn't, it may have been percolating in a different way, but there was not this outright violence. Mm-hmm. Many of them tell me that they believe that it has been the rise of radical Islam and jihadism that has really brought that to the surface. And that whether you're saying that's a cultural thing or whether it's a religious thing, I think we can't ignore the fact that radical jihadists have taken on a very, very different tactic. Let's put it that way, if you want to call violence a tactic. But that is why I think this drives many of us to say, okay, what is happening here? What has changed? And we know that there's violence throughout Africa, you know, whether it's in South Sudan, whether it's in other places that we are seeing. Oftentimes, if right now in the Rwanda and in the Congo, that conflict that is there right now, there is a lot of mix to it, but I think specifically when it comes to Nigeria, that there has been some sort of change.
Yeah, and if I may just respond very quickly to that. While my family's from the southern part of Nigeria, I grew up in the middle belt of Nigeria. And obviously understanding the dynamics of the middle belt, indigene versus non-indigene, I was also part and parcel faced looking at how things have evolved over time. So even while we talk about Boko Haram today, or the recently identified new terror group, Lukarawa, that was just mentioned in November, it also dates all the way back to the 1980s, where there were groups like the Metasina movement and others. So the points
And
that I'm
oftentimes that was regarding moving of energy and those kinds of things, correct?
Yeah. And so the point I was making, or the point that I'm making, is that the environment, the weakness of governance allows groups like these, allows ideologies like these to thrive. And the weakness of governance is at the root of these concerns, because data shows us that Nigerians value their unity, Nigerians value their diversity. Very recent data shows us that it's not about religion or ethnicity, but the weakness is in government.
I think we're on parallel tracks. We may not have our tracks cross exactly, but we're on parallel tracks. I think there is a weakness of government that is clear on that. But I do want to move on, Mr. Chairman. We talked about, and in fact, Ms. Onubogu referenced the December 2023 Christmas Eve killings. I led a letter to the State Department, Mr. Chairman, that included some folks who were on the committee, expressing concern to Secretary Blinken and their decision in 2023 to not designate Nigeria as a country of particular concern. In May 1 of 2024, I received a 3-page letter back from the Assistant Secretary where the word Christian appeared once. It was alongside Islam in the response, and I'd like to submit that for the record, if
Without
I could.
objection, so ordered.
Yeah, basically my calls to the State Department went really unanswered, and frankly, I think the State Department employed, shall we say, active avoidance on the issue, and I was given inadequate responses that failed to address the concerns that many of us had. That, I think, is part of the problem with the last administration and among their staff, was an overt refusal to acknowledge that Christians specifically were being targeted. They would have no problem identifying others who had been targeted, rightfully so, other ethnic minorities, but when it specifically came to Christians, it wasn't politically a good time for them to talk about it, and that's a huge problem. And the fact remains that 90% of global total Christian deaths occur on the African continent, and that's according to Open Doors, somebody that you had referenced earlier. So I want to ask all the witnesses, do you believe that the Tinubu administration is intentionally not taking the required actions to ensure the safety and security of we could broaden it out for all ethnic minorities, but let's specifically address Christians as well throughout the country? And Ms. Shea.
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for your questions and your comments. And just to address the terror issue, or the violence issue that you raised, Nigeria did get worse on the global index for terrorism over the past year. So it's quantitative, that it is intensifying. And the Fulani for the last 20 years have been being armed with automatic weapons by, according to scholars, Nigerian scholars, by cattle breeders who hire them. And so this is contributing to the uptick in violence as well. I've forgotten your question now.
Oh, just whether the Tinubu administration is
yes.
sort of intentionally, are they doing what is really required to ensure safety of their citizens?
Yeah, you know, on intent and what they intend to do, I've tried to bring out prominent voices in my testimony, my written testimony, to who believe that this is deliberate on the part of the government. There are others who feel that the government is just lax, but some feel that the government is complicit. And I saw that, frankly, in the Catholic bishop's letter that was released recently, that was referred to by me and the bishop, about the fact that Islamic law of closing down, or at least somebody's interpretation of Islamic law, of closing down all schools in some of the 12 northern states to forcibly observe Ramadan, is part of the bishop's alarm at this is a sort of creeping introduction of Islam as the law of the land, not only in those 12 northern states, but throughout the country. So I've heard that from a number of prominent voices, whether Catholic bishops or others, civic leaders, and even governors of some of the southern states, central states.
I'm going to skip over, if you don't mind, Mr. Perkins, to the bishop, and just what is your take on the Tinubu administration? Are they actively trying to protect that, or are they allowing it and turning a blind eye?
I think, to my own opinion, the government certainly has good intention, but there's no implementation. And I think it's simply because they want to be politically correct, not to offend any particular group of persons. And so that's why the inactivity is taking place, and people are feeling emboldened to continue to do what is going on. And the failure of the security forces to apprehend those who are involved is a clear sign that everybody said that people are dying. So if the government wants to take action, they will do.
And you've been very generous, Mr. Chairman. I do also want to hit on one other thing. This hearing is specifically about Nigeria, but given the expertise and the people that we have, love to hear a little broader view. And I had the opportunity to recently sit down with Bishop Dennis Nthumbe, who is the African director of Israel Allies Foundation. We talked at length about the systematic persecutions of Christians and Jews that are happening throughout the continent, and the rise in anti-Semitism there. And Mr. Chairman, for the record, I'd also like to post the bishop's report on accounts of widespread violence and destruction of churches and other religious sites that have been happening. So I'd like to submit that for the record here. And in fact, the bishop is here with us today in the back, and I applaud him and his work as well. But getting back to the specifically Nigeria, we have seen a rise throughout the African continent. We're talking specifically, though, about the tools that we have in Congress. And I'm curious from each one of the witnesses, is the CPC, this designation, is that necessary and is it warranted for Nigeria right now, or is this some sort of knee-jerk reaction?
Well, I think it's warranted. We can't fudge the facts. We need the truth to come out. This is one of the worst situations in the world, as you know, for Christians. And the law is clear. If the government engages in or tolerates egregious violations of religious freedom, which the government certainly is, regardless of whether it's deliberate or not on their part, I think that we must do that. And it does put pressure. Governments do not like to be on the short list of the world's worst persecutors. It is a platform for beginning to reassess American policy on how we deal with this partnership that's increasingly uncomfortable and untenable as they become more terror-ridden and their religious communities are attacked relentlessly with impunity. So yes.
I'll put you down as a yes.
Put me down as a yes.
And I don't want to necessarily have to go back over as to why it was removed. Our job here today is does this administration need to reapply the CPC? Mr. Perkins.
I would say yes. If I can provide some context, during my time as chairman of USERF, we didn't randomly give out CPC as, labels that we just wanted to go after a particular country. In fact, during my time, we worked to take countries off our watch list.
That is the goal.
That is
right?
the goal,
we
but
want
this
to
is a
improve
tool.
those relations.
This is a tool. We used it. We actually took Sudan off the list. I traveled to Sudan. Unfortunately, things have changed there in the last few years. But we were very hopeful, and this CPC status was a tool. They wanted to get it off so that they could have access to international banking. They didn't want to be on that list. It worked. We worked to get Egypt. I met with President El-Sisi multiple times to get them off the watch list, and they were making great progress.
It's kind of amazing if you look at some of the lists of countries like Egypt that have been on this, and the fact that Nigeria and its current situation isn't seems a little stunning to me.
It does. That's why I do think it needs to be on the list and utilized as a tool to address both the religious freedom issue and the underlying issues.
I've taken way too much time, but Bishop quickly and then Ms. Onubogu. Do you believe Nigeria should be on this designation
My
list?
response would be, thank you very much. My response would be yes. One, because CPC designation is not punitive. That is one. It's corrective, so that you'll be able to see
Not
what...
punitive to the citizens
Exactly.
specifically,
It's
unlike a lot of other sanctions.
Exactly. It's not punitive. It's supposed to be corrective so that you'll be able to realign yourself with the global practices like human rights abuse violations. You need to know. And you have to, because Nigeria is not an entity. You can't say it's just because it's a kind of domestic affair. Domestic affair involves people's lives. And they are going. So the world cannot watch that citizens are just being killed. So I would think if you do this, that helps to bring the financiers of these programs or these violations to book. First, the ammunition these terrorists or Fulanis or carry along is not manufactured in Nigeria. It's bought somewhere. Those local boys in the bush don't have money to buy those ammunition. Who supplies them? Who equips them? So if this is done, certainly there will be a searchlight and we'll know who is involved. So for me, yes.
Okay. Ms. Onubogu.
Thank you for that question. Making a designation, is what you've said, is beyond my institutional purview. What I provide is more policy-focused, non-partisan, biased research, ensuring that the facts speak for itself. I'll leave that to the committee to make the designation. But as we look at the research in Nigeria and on Nigeria, it is important that we understand that Nigeria is not your typical nation state. This is a state that is where identities are formed along lines of ethnicity, religion, and so at the end of the day, those that may be trying to hold accountable may not actually see themselves as accountable to the citizens. So this is why I say it's important for us to take a look at the research, take a look at the data to make informed decisions. Thank you.
So is that an official pass? No, not an opinion as to whether we ought to have the CPC.
As I said, it's beyond my institutional purview.
I would argue, Mr. Chairman, it's a policy debate and discussion that we are having. But with that, I've taken a lot of time, and I appreciate that to my colleagues as well. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having lived and worked all over the world, including across the African continent, on international health and development, I think it's very important that we think about how we use all the tools in the toolbox. And I have appreciated USCIRF's work on protecting all religious freedom and calling out countries, including my birth country of India, for issues around persecution of Christians and Muslims. But I think the central question here goes to Ms. Onubogu's point about weakness of government. I think that's the phrase you used, and I think it really is critical, because it's not that I don't agree with Mr. Perkins that we should address religious freedom. I do think we should. But I think at the core, when you look at this issue, it is the weakness of government that allows extremism of any religion to thrive. And so that's why I think that the way in which USAID has now been stripped and paused, all of the funding has been paused. 83% of funding for USAID has currently been stopped, is a problem, because many of those projects were actually trying to address the underlying root causes that I think perhaps there's some agreement on the panel that that we should be addressing. And so The New York Times recently reported a list of words and terms that the Trump administration has banned or restricted from government communications, and those included things like cultural differences, community diversity, discrimination, prejudice, victim, and even women. Makes it very hard to think about nuanced programs that address those underlying causes. And so, Ms. Onubogu, I want to ask you, how would banning projects that utilize those terms affect the U.S.'s ability to accurately describe and respond to violence in Nigeria?
So thank you for the question. Working in complex environments like Nigeria and elsewhere requires being able to take into account the total picture of occurrences in different parts of the country. The way we define issues as peace and violence may seem different in different communities and across different communities in Nigeria. So it would be it would be necessary to take into account the complexity and diversity of Nigeria towards trying to ensure we can devise sustainable solutions to addressing root causes of violence there.
In fact, I used diversity in my opening statement, but that, I guess, would tag it as a project that's not worthwhile. I want to specifically focus on a State Department project in northeastern Nigeria called Nigerian Youth Care. This program has been suspended by the Trump administration. It provided Nigerian youth with mentorship and training on how to bridge religious divides, and it launched initiatives that were meant to reduce hate speech and inflammatory rhetoric on social media. Could you explain, Ms. Onubogu, how programs that focus on interreligious dialogue can actually assist in reducing the occurrence of religious violence and extremism?
Thank you. As to point about youth making up 70% of the population in Nigeria is below the age of 35. And I think has been referenced by others on this panel too as well, the importance of engaging youth. I think in complex environments like Nigeria, where identities are formed around ethnicity or religion, and especially in communities where we have seen protracted conflicts that have taken on a different life of their own time after time. Again, as I mentioned in the case of Plateau State, we've seen conflicts going on for over 20 years. It's important to bring voices together, to bring people together, to bring communities together, to be able to identify what the problems are and find ways to work through them together. So being able to push interreligious dialogue or interfaith dialogue, and some of them which I've witnessed on the ground is a good example of work that could be done to bridge divides, bridge gaps in Nigeria. In fact, data actually shows that in Nigeria, as in some other countries too as well on the continent, but in Nigeria specifically, religious leaders actually are really trusted by their communities. And we've seen several examples of interfaith mediation efforts across Nigeria that have been really successful.
Well, that leads me to another project around good governance. The International Republican Institute formerly funded a project in Nigeria to educate political party leaders on good governance strategies and bringing traditionally politically marginalized groups in Nigeria, including women, young people, religious minorities, into the political process. That's another project that this administration has ended. What's the importance of representative democracy in Nigeria and the value of representation for traditionally marginalized groups, including religious minorities? I'll start with you, but I'm interested in your perspective on this as well, Mr. Perkins.
Thank you. So as I mentioned in my remarks, elections and political appointments are two important areas where we see the interplay between religion and politics, where we've seen time and time again that politicians romanticize Nigeria's unity, but basically when it comes to elections, they just use it to instigate and galvanize votes. As I mentioned, this year, 2025, is a critical year for elections in Nigeria. The chair of Nigeria's Independent National Election Commission, his term runs out in December of this year. If we go back to 2023 and we see how divisive those elections were, it's important to start laying the groundwork now to ensure that political actors are not in a position to utilize religion or utilize ethnicity to foment violence and to garner votes. We're already seeing examples of what's happening with the by-elections that happened in 2024. So it's really important to start as the country, as Nigeria starts thinking about sort of the makeup of the leadership, what the new leadership of Nigeria's independent election commission could look like. This is an opportunity to start engaging and identifying key holders in the key stakeholders in the political space and in civil society as well, to work together towards ensuring that citizens basically the faith of citizens is restored in the electoral process.
Thank you. And Mr. Perkins, as I said, I've utilized some of your work and Yusuf's work in other regions because I think it is important for us to be consistent in allowing for all religious freedom, not just for some. And so your views on how religious freedom and governance, good governance and democracy interact, and why it's important to ensure that we really are protecting it in a place like Nigeria, where you have a very divided population religiously, and you need to pay attention to all religious freedom. How would you speak to the importance of that?
Well, thank you for that question, and I appreciate your interest in this, and you've correctly analyzed it. I did a lot of interfaith work in the Middle East, sitting down with imams, sitting down with evangelicals in places where they were a very extreme minority. Here in Nigeria, it's a pretty much divided country equally. I think it goes back to what has been identified here is the governance of the country and the will of the current administration. Now, we could point to a lot of programs. I bet if you and I sit down and had a cup of coffee, we would identify probably a number of programs that we would agree with. Probably wouldn't agree on everything, but we would agree on some things. We've been doing those programs for decades in Nigeria, and we've not seen the positive outcomes. And so when we move to see the State Department designate in 2020 this country as a country of particular concern, it was to get the attention of the government of the country, so that we might get them to be willfully engaged like we've seen in other countries. So I think this is really not a question about are some of these projects viable and should they be in place. I think we would all agree that yes, there are some.
Well,
But
not everyone agrees, unfortunately. I mean, 83% of these projects have been cut. And
I understand that.
The question is, do you take a hatchet to something or do you take a scalpel to something?
Well, I think we're in a situation where we've got to do something different because the outcomes have not changed. And I think taking this approach, as we're focused on today, declaring this designation as a country of particular concern, hopefully would get the government's attention so that we can have this collaboration to address the underlying issues that has allowed religion to be utilized as a weapon of division.
Well, I agree with you that religion is utilized as a weapon too often, and there are extremists in all religions. I've seen that, my birth country of India I'm proud that we've had so many religions living side by side, and my home state of Kerala is the place where we have the most Christians in the country, and so I understand the importance of that. But I again go back to your very important point about all of the pieces that are essential here, and I hope that as we continue this dialogue, we think about what it does when you just destroy everything all at once. The hole that is left in the countries that we have been providing critical aid to is enormous. And we know that extremists go to fill any hole that is there. And so I would just argue that actually it's a very important part of how the United States should be engaging with Nigeria and with countries around the world to not eliminate and create huge holes in humanitarian assistance and in governance and democracy projects and all of these things, because when you do, you are creating another opportunity for chaos to be exploited. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Very much. I recognize Mr. Baird.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for holding this very informative meeting. I really appreciate the witnesses being here, but I want to do this. During the Trump administration, Nigeria was rightfully placed on the special watch list and eventually was designated as a country of particular concern, CPC we've been talking about. I was disappointed by the Biden administration's decision to not designate Nigeria as a CPC in the period of 20 through 24 with no real reason, and that was despite consistent recommendations from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom to maintain that designation. So as the second Trump administration continues its work, the committee has a unique opportunity to reevaluate the United States policy toward Nigeria in a manner that bolsters stability and religious freedom. So my question goes to Ms. Shea and Mr. Perkins. So a country that is designated and cited as a CPC carries with it a suite of varying sanctions that the president can levy on those countries. So how would these potential punishments which the president can waive for national security reasons, how would that prepare Nigerian government to make more systematic action to prevent religious activated violence?
Thank you for your question. I will just give one quick answer, and then I'll turn it over to Mr. Perkins, who has a whole roster of recommendations that they developed during his term on USERV. You know, Nigeria is a rich country. It's one of the largest economies, if not the largest economy in Africa. So it's rich in natural resources. It's rich in human resources. And when Nigerians come to our country, they do extremely well. In fact, they're one of the most successful immigrant groups in the United States. They need law and order. They need a government with the political will to apply the law and to hold people accountable, as we all acknowledged today. And to do that, I think that they're going to need some pressure, some sanctions on particular officials to deny them visas and banking accounts and financial opportunities here. So I recommend, and Chairman Smith was the pioneer of this in his legislation that he got through. So I think we have to make good use of that. And the Magnitsky sanctions, the Global Magnitsky Act. And so I'll stop there and let Mr. Perkins.
Well, as has been discussed already, it allows for both surgical going after certain individuals, as Nina was just talking about, with sanctions. It would also affect a foreign aid, which I believe will be coming back in different forms and fashions, that it will get their attention and put them on a particular path of having to give an account. It will affect programs. We've been talking about programs, how necessary those programs are, but it affects that. It affects businesses. It depends on how far the president, the administration will want to go. Unfortunately, what we've seen in the past is that these sanctions, when we have a CPC status, they've been waived, as you made reference to in your comments. I would encourage the administration not to waive these sanctions, but to apply them until until Nigeria wants to come to terms to address the underlying issues that led to the CPC status.
One other question in that regard. You know, sometimes we send this assistance, but it ends up being diverted off because of the situation in the country. And so I think it's important that we have governance, as we've been talking about in this session, in order, and you mentioned that about governments, in order to make sure that the programs are administered properly. So I agree with that. So I thank both of you. So Ms. Onubogu, do you have any questions or any concerns?
Nothing to
Nope.
add. Thank you.
Mr. Bishop? No? I thank you and I yield back.
Mr. Jackson.
Thank you much, Chairman, and honored to be with you. Thank each and every one of you for participating today in your outstanding comments. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge, a question in general, are there any Muslims in the panel present today?
Gentlemen yield. I'll tell you why I didn't do it.
Yes, sir.
If we had a Muslim here, when he or she went back, they might be killed. I met with many Muslim imams in Nigeria on several trips. Every time I was told that if they speak out, they're marked and they will be visited. Now, the Christians are in a similar but not exactly quid pro quo what's going to happen. That's why we're very worried about the bishop, but that's why there's nobody here. But just so you know, I speak out for the Muslims as well, but here we did not want to have that situation because we thought of it. We thought of it very seriously.
Okay, thank you so much, Chairman. I just wanted the record to reflect that. Question would probably is, in the dismantling of the USAID, the Trump administration recently terminated a USAID program called Partner that supported peace-building efforts in northern and north-central Nigeria. The $2 million project helped to strengthen the country's early warning and security response systems and provide training for local leaders, including religious leaders, on conflict mitigation and conflict resolution. This project and others like it help provide local leaders with the mechanisms to alert law enforcement to possible conflicts before they happen. Partner also helped to facilitate communications between farmer and herder community leaders, often individuals from different religious backgrounds, in an attempt to bridge the gap between the two groups. Ms. Onubogu, what are some of these early warning signs of conflict that you've experienced?
Thank you for your question. I think going back to my initial remarks, security is at the center of addressing a lot of these concerns that we see in Nigeria. While several communities have been able to put in place early warning signals based on how they communicate in their communities, being able to know who is a new person that comes into the community, or if they see things changing, they're able to track changes in their communities as well. The concern has often been that sometimes response is lacking, and response is lacking because of the way Nigeria's security structure, Nigeria's security architecture is set up. As I mentioned, there have been several attempts at police reform in Nigeria. This is an area where the government needs to strengthen its approach. We have seen, even from Open Doors themselves, have also mentioned that the Nigerian government under Tinubu has been making some attempts to address the security concerns, to ensure that they're able to bolster the response mechanisms. As I mentioned, securities are pretty strong at identifying where the problem areas are, where the gaps are. They should continue to be supported to ensure they build resilient structures in their communities to withstand any sort of violence or intrusion that might come in. But on the security side, on bolstering and strengthening the security architecture, these are areas where we need to focus on to ensure that early response also matches the early warning signals that are coming from communities.
Thank you so much. And this is a question open to all. When we talk about security and security drivers, what would you say is the leading cause of the security or the insecurity drivers?
So Nigeria is really faced across every region of the country is facing some form of insecurity or the other. There are different forms of conflict, all of them overlapping in some ways or the other, and all protracted over time. So they all take on a different shape or form of their own.
Is there a commonality?
The underlying issue there is a lack of governance, and also just the weaknesses in holding perpetrators accountable for their actions. That is the underlying issue there.
Okay. Would you like to add to that, Mr. Perkins?
I agree. And when we're talking about the issue of governance, it's really kind of the hub, which the spokes are the programs. And without the hub, the programs don't really work. They'll collapse. And I'm familiar with some of those programs, the one that you actually mentioned. There's also a lot of non-governmental organizations that are working to facilitate communication between various faith groups, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. But when you have a lack of response, as the bishop testified, there was a 2-week notice given, but no response from the government. And so until we get the attention of the hub and we get Nigeria's government agreeing that they've got to reform and provide protection and rights for all their people, I don't think our programs work.
Well, let me ask you one other question, generally to the panel. Will the CPC increase or decrease food security amongst the Nigerians?
Well, I will say from history, what we have found is that the CPC status gets the attention of the government. And
the question is, will it increase or decrease?
Well, I think long-term it'll increase because it will deal with the underlying issues which have created instability, insecurity in the country.
How about in the short term?
We have a real risk in the short term just because of present circumstances. As we've talked about, the bread belt or the bread basket of the country is the farmers are being displaced. So we have a real issue, and this is why this is urgent, is because if we don't address it now, and you see the migration coming out of Nigeria, as has been testified to today, the surrounding countries can't handle it. You will have a serious shortage of food, shelter, and security.
Okay, thank you. I'm very familiar with the region and the insecurity on the northern borders. Probably the last part I would leave to that is we first start with the demographics, and I would assume most of us are Christians that are in here. And when you have children, even scripturally, the Bible has a mandate on us feeding the children. And I don't think many of the children in Nigeria are that ideologically drawn. If you look at more than half the population, the 110 million people that are under the age of 18 years of age are not that ideologically driven. And I looked up a number that yesterday I found probably pretty astounding, that 41% of the population of Nigerians are under the age of 15. (41% of the population is under the age of 15, and I think that the CPC would enhance more insecurity for food. I think it's very important that you feed children, and out of that you can gain their attention. Even we know the scriptures of Jesus having had the lunch and fed the multitude, and he brought those children in, he fed them and asked them to come forward. Ms. Shea?
Yes, thank you. Yes, I agree that food and medicine need to continue in our foreign assistance programs for Nigeria. I think that we also need to tackle the underlying issues of terror and violence so that people can go back to farming, because there's no dearth of arable farmland. So I do think that giving hope, sustaining the people during this period is important, but it's also important to correct the problem, because this is a man-made problem of extremism, of violence, of AKs being handed out, and it's outrageous that the government doesn't take back the land that's been taken and give it back to their proper owners. That's no way to run a country. So the beauty of CPC is that it has sanctions that are surgical, that can target particular people, not the entire country. I wouldn't recommend CPC to have a sanction that would cut off food or medical aid.
Are there any dangers to using CPC? Any downside?
I don't see any downside. I see, it's like a terrorism index. You need to have a factual analysis on what are the problems of the country to solve them. And if we only see climate change, which is a problem, but if that's the sole rationale, and that's what the UNHCR seems to think, based on its writings on its website, the Mimi case that I gave in my testimony, they concluded was the result of climate change only. They ignored the religious identities involved and the intent and motives of the people who were attacking Mimi and her family. So that climate change is a problem. There are no short-term solutions to that. There is a short-term solution to radicalization and violence and criminality. It's police work.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, in closing, a population that's under 30, that's 70%, I think that our nation will be best served in trying to get this young nation that is now showing its maturity and forming a democracy that's still extremely fragile, that has a lot of conflict borders on the north, that I think creating more hardship on such a young population, and particularly on children that are under the age of 15. I like food as a tool more than sanctions and punitive measures. I think it's theologically sound, and I've not heard that being expressed. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I want to just yield myself a couple of minutes, and then I'll go to my colleague. Just for the record, and I thank you for your concern for food. I've written 2 laws, Global Food Security Act, which is our law. The IRFA bill, when we did it back in 1998, we made sure that humanitarian assistance was exempted. The idea of taking away food security, and your point was well taken, would be counterproductive. I mean, one of the hallmarks of the legislation on Global Food Security Act was to emphasize the first 1,000 days of life from conception to the second birthday, that if mother and baby get the food, folic acid, all kinds of supplementation, and we do have a very good program, as you know, as does the UN, on those things, food security, you get healthier kids. And one of the focuses that we've had in Nigeria and elsewhere, but especially in Nigeria, is stunting. And when you have that first 1,000 days fully, and the women get the supplementation, good solid nutrition, baby and mother thrive. So great point. The good news is that in writing the legislation, we want to make sure that that was not malaffected in any country, including Nigeria. And I would just add that where all of these supplementations have happened, including places like Honduras, which has another problem with stunting, it doesn't go away, but it greatly mitigates it. So thank you for your point. I mean, if the food is just so essential, and the beauty of the IRFA bill is that it does provide, it's a 2-step process. Just, I think you all know this, but the first one is the designation, getting it right in calling out an egregious violator in terms of what they were doing or what they're tolerating by not answering the call, and the bishop and anyone else says to the police, please come. We've got motorcycles here and they're killing people, and they don't show up, and they never show up. And then there's no accountability, there's no investigation, there's no prosecution. I mean, that is just absolutely egregious. So designating the country as a CPC gets them on the record that we've taken note, you violated our law, and we're going to take action. Now, the next point is the action phase, and that is purely up to the administration, no matter who's in the White House. And as Mr. Perkins indicated, there has been a lack of part 2 since 1998. We find the exact same thing on trafficking. I wrote our trafficking laws, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. I'm the prime author of it. It has the same double edge. You start off by designate a country, be honest and accurate if they have a problem with sex and labor trafficking, and then part 2 is the enforcement of sanctions that are prescribed in the law. So I'm all, we're on the same page. We've got to make sure that food security is available and people are helped by it. So thank you for that. I appreciate that very much. I would like to now recognize Mr. Ozlewski for such time as he may consume.
Thank you all very much. Representative Olszewski from Baltimore. I really appreciate you, Chairman Smith, our ranking member. And I want to thank all of our witnesses, who I know many of whom have traveled a great distance. I really appreciate you being here. Thanks to modern technology, I'm glad that I was able to listen in through the entirety of today's hearing, even as I dealt with traffic myself in my travels today. I'm going to start by saying I as someone of deep faith, like many of my colleagues here, I am deeply concerned about both religious freedoms and violence, religious violence, but also violence of all types. What we know that what is happening in Nigeria demands that we all work together in response. I think we can agree that given the scale and the duration of the violence, given the importance of Nigeria as a country, both to Africa but also to the world, I think it really demands that we are open to thinking differently about our historical responses. But I think that we need to think holistically about that. And maybe that means not just looking at what our traditional tools have been. I think we can start, and I would encourage this administration, the Trump administration, to openly call out the actions of the government and their failure to take action. I saw all of the heads nodding around the conversation around accountability across the board to a person. I think we could send our Secretary of State to go talk to the government, to raise these concerns, to lift up these American voices. And I think that we can then indicate that additional action might be forthcoming. I think what's troubling, as some of my colleagues have raised, however, though, is that even as we're contemplating sanctions and actions, we are seeing a retreat of our investment and our involvement in the country. A lot of conversations already happened around USAID, so I won't retread those, Mr. Chairman. But I do want to dig in a little bit around the issue of education, which is one of those issues that's deeply personal to me as a former educator. And it's also one of those places that have not been exempted from the funding freeze and the retractment that we're seeing. And I see the Bishop nodding, and I actually wanted to direct one of my questions to you, Bishop, because as my colleague, Representative Jackson, mentioned, there are so many young people in this country. They're the future of the country, and education, I think, is so foundational to the success of Nigeria, but also to combating this religious persecution, the religious violence that we're seeing. And so, we know, for example, that Boko Haram and other terrorist organizations have targeted schools to undermine education across the country. An estimated 2,000 Christian schools were attacked in Nigeria between 2009 and 2021. Hundreds of teachers have been deliberately killed, with thousands more forced to flee. We know that also, since 2014, the U.S. has invested in our primary education system in Nigeria, helping 2.9 million students improve their literacy and training in 21,595 teachers. And out-of-school youth programs, we've reached almost more than 500,000 children in affected conflict regions. Again, we know that proper education and effective education is a key to drive out violent extremism. Again, the Trump administration canceled our education programs in Nigeria. So I would say, Bishop, if you could just speak a little bit about how we can keep our children safe and our educators safe, and the impact of these programs. And I'd just also open it up to anyone else on the panel who might want to talk a little bit about the importance of investing in education to tackle some of these issues as well.
Thank you very much for your intervention. But I think also, just like you said, education is the key to the human development. And education for us is not just academic excellence or pursuance, but the holistic approach to the person's life. And it's actually what this crisis of violence have turned Nigeria for the past 2 decades is what we can't quantify. In villages where schools have been closed down, burned, and people have left, these children are in the camps. And actually, they don't have any basic form of training or formation. And of course, some of them survived looking at their parents being killed. Maybe they were able to run, young children, age of 12, 13. And then some, seriously and of serious concern, women are still giving birth in these camps and without education. I'm not talking of health or dignities for the women and all that, but this basically means you have some people who are about 18 years who have not really had any basic education in some of these camps and these states. And of course, it's difficult to change their orientation or mentality. Some of them are already, because we need to de-radicalize them from some of these things that is going on in their minds. And if education is closed, I tell you, that is like we are breeding another group of terrors, and at the age of 25, they become old enough to handle whatever they want to, and then nobody will stay. And what we do maybe on my local level, as a bishop, we had what we call education in emergency, which actually working with the state government or so, there are about 200 and something of these children, though not those in primary school, but secondary school in all my schools. 250 something in my schools, because these you can give them boarding education. But I know what it means. What about the younger ones who can't leave their families or leave their mothers? We have talked severally with the government to establish these schools in these camps, whereby some of these people who are displaced are degree holders who can also take care of them, and the government pay them the stipends for them to keep, and the government is not interested in it. But I tell you, this is going to spell doom for a nation in this present age whereby we are, that education, will say, is the key. It's becoming so difficult. We are getting back to the barbaric stage, and that is what I think these perpetrators want to be. And like we said, if they are able to handle these perpetrators and bring them to book through this designation of CPC, many people will be able to be held accountable for what is going on. Thereby, there will be some fear instilled in them. If you do this, the government will come after you. And if the government is seriously minded and concerned, I tell you, these things will end. And it's not just immediately, yes, not just because of a short term, but I tell you, if the IDPs return to their ancestral homes, to be honest with you, in the issue of 3-4 years, they wouldn't ask anybody for feeding. 5 years ago, they weren't asking us to feed them. 10 years ago, they weren't looking for food from anybody, because they are subsistence farmers taking care of their needs, training their children, because I'm a victim and I come from such a background. My father, my parents were farmers, and that way he trained us. And we went to boarding school in the 80s. So I see no reason why we should not bump it in this age. This is happening, and the government is keeping quiet. That's why we are applying for this, because if this is not done, we are going to breed hooligans as a nation.
So just with that, Mr. Chairman, I will recommit to work with you and this subcommittee on any other actions we can work together on to look at this differently. I appreciate the answer, and just will, I think, reinforce my earlier point that I hope to see this administration act in the meantime, and also hope to work to find ways to not just reinstitute our funding for education, but also I think this reinforces the point we should be doing more to help, especially our young people, whether it's vocational training so they can become subsistence farmers, or to do more to ensure that we have this lack of radicalization among our young people. I think it's so important that we catch people young. Mr. Perkins, looks like you wanted to mention something.
I just wanted to, you're absolutely right, education is a key element, and that's why the radical Islamists have been targeting the schools. There's been 17 mass abductions in the last 6 years from schools. Over 1,700 kids have been snatched out. And the reason for that, number one, is targeting girls to keep them from getting the education. So again, it's the underlying issue of security and the government performing its role.
Yeah, no, and I know that that's true for Christian and Islam, those in the schools alike. And agree, but it's not an either or, right? We can do both. We can both hold governments accountable for taking action for perpetrators, but also I just want to reinforce the point that I think we also need to do the other piece of this work as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Just to conclude, and anything you'd like to add as we close, I would like to recognize Pastor Emmanuel Anagbe, who good friend. We traveled together a few times to Nigeria. He introduced me to the CAN, the Association of Christians Leaders, and he also was able to arrange for me to meet with several of the parents of Chibok girls, and that was moving beyond words to see how much suffering they were enduring. And so thank you, Pastor, for your insights over many, many years. We're also joined by Pastor Akila Yusuf, who's the regional overseer of the All House on the Rock churches in Northeast Nigeria. He's the president of Cutting Edge Ministries Network, about 200 pastors in the Middle Belt region. So thank you to him for being here today. I deeply appreciate that. Just to conclude, and again, any final comments you might want to make, I would note that the bishop's village was burnt yesterday. I mean, it's like it's ever present, the violence that's being endured by the Christians, and to a lesser extent, but no less significant, by the Muslims who are pious and want to live out their faith. I remember meeting with one imam who told me, and he spoke very highly of Christians, and he said, Boko Haram is not us. It's not us, but we can't speak out. If we do, we're targeted. And so another reason why we do not have a Muslim cleric from Nigeria here today. But if you wanted to, let me just also point out the letter that came to Mr. Hazenga. Part of our frustration has been that the Nigerian government has not been successful, and they even acknowledge it in a letter explaining why they did not redesignate the country of particular concern to Nigeria. And they said the government has been working to find solutions to the problems, but has been largely unsuccessful in addressing these threats. How hard have they really worked? I mean, law enforcement is so basic to any functioning society, and if the killers and the murderers and the rapists can operate with impunity, that democracy is in dire threat, and individual lives of believers are then put in grave risk as well. Bishop, your point today in your testimony where you said militant Fulani herdsmen are terrorists, they steal and vandalize, they kill and boast about it, they kidnap and rape, and they enjoy total impunity from the elected officials. None of them have been arrested and brought to justice. That is the message we are bringing to the government, that we are aware of it, and we're going to do everything we can to try to get a CPC designation immediately from this administration. What they do in terms of sanctioning is purely up to them, but hopefully there won't be a need, because there will be a movement towards trying to address these unaddressed needs. And it's not like a lot of us haven't been raising it for decades. I have, you guys have, Nina, you've been doing it forever. So we just, and Tony, you as well, we're not impatient. It just has to happen. So any final remarks before we conclude? Bishop.
Thank you very much once again for this. My simple request, which I don't know how best it's going to go, but all the witnesses have been able to make it somehow to work with the community and the religious leaders. For instance, I would say, in case of assistance, in terms of funding, if it's possible for the religious leaders in those places be able to come to know what exactly is coming to the areas, because we as religious leaders go to where government cannot go. And most of these people who are displaced eventually run back to the churches, wherever they be. That is the only place they have safety, humanly speaking, not just that it's guaranteed. But then, safety seems that they looked after their needs and the basic things we can. And we know if the government works, the army will protect these people back to their homes, and in a very short while, 5-10 years reasonably, Nigeria will bounce back to its status.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, again for convening this hearing, and I hope that there will be future opportunities for hearings on Nigeria and other countries across the African continent to be able to discuss U.S.-Africa relations. Just to restate a few points that I made about the importance of Nigeria, which is one that several U.S. administrations have often highlighted. What happens in Nigeria also impacts the broader West African region, and we are aware of the issues that are happening across West Africa. On the question on security, Nigeria's security challenges are also impacted by what happens outside of the country as well. In 2018-2017, there was data that basically showed that a lot of the small arms that are present in Nigeria, that there are about 50% of the small arms in the West African region are in Nigeria. Obviously, that might have grown as well. So there are overlapping security challenges and significant help that is needed to restructure and reform Nigeria's security architecture. I think at the end of the day, we have to examine and ask, you know, how labels and designations could work and if those actually address the root causes of the issues that we are trying to tackle in Nigeria. And I think for me, leaving it on that point is the root causes of the conflicts that we see are complex, and it's important that there is a holistic effort on the part of the U.S. in partnership with Nigerian government and civil society actors to address the causes of these conflicts.
Well, thank you again to our distinguished witnesses. I do want to note that Samson Oge, who is here, who is the chargé for the Nigerian Embassy, thank you for joining us today. I would also point out, you know, in terms of capability, I remember being in Bosnia during the war there. I was in Darfur years later, and I ran into a peacekeeper who was at both places. Where was he from? Nigeria. Totally committed to securing the peace. Major Ajumbo was his name. And I was so moved by, he was so committed to peace. So there's a capability there that needs to be recognized, realized, and really led by those in authority, and that's what's been lacking, you know, a failure to govern, to quote one of our witnesses today. So thank you so much. I want to thank our witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask that you respond to them in writing pursuant to the committee rules. All members have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned, and thank you so very much.